Hello Year 10. So today we're going to be looking at a poem called Afternoons. But first of all, as always, we're going to be looking at some vocabulary. So we should be nice and familiar with rapture by now. We've focused on it in several lessons. So recall what we mean by rapture and then think, why might the Romantic poets view being in a natural surrounding as a time of rapture? So do please pause the video and answer that question. So our new word today is domesticity, which basically, being domestic is essentially being at home or family life. So when we think about traditional gender roles, which you're going to hear me saying a lot in today's lesson, traditionally, the domestic role would be that of the woman, of the wife, because traditionally and stereotypically, the idea of the husband as being the breadwinner and going out to earn the money, and the woman being the stay-at-home mum, looking after the children, washing the clothes, cooking dinner, hoovering the carpet. That's what this idea of being domestic is. And this is a poem that does definitely look at domesticity. It looks at stereotypical gender roles as well. So what I'd like you to sort of think, and we'd have an interesting discussion, I'm sure, if we were in school right now. Do you think the word domesticity has positive or negative connotations? Do you think the word domestic is making you think of something negative or something positive? So you can pause the video now, have a go at answering both questions. So the Romantic poets would view being in a natural surrounding as a time of rapture, because rapture means intense joy and happiness, and we know that the Romantic poets were at their happiest when they were free to roam about the countryside and free to worship the sort of amazing entity that was nature. And we've looked now at 4 of the Romantic poets and 2 poems that are considered neo-Romantic poets, which is Hawk Roosting and Death of a Naturalist. There's one final Romantic poem in the anthology that we're going to look at, but that we're not going to do that yet. We're going to be looking at that next term when we look at the love poems. So domesticity then, positive or negative? Now, it's quite interesting to view this from a 21st century perspective, because there is a lot that has happened to break down traditional gender roles, if you like. So some people would view this idea of a woman being at home as a privilege, being able to be at home, have a nice home to live in, take care and maintain that home, to raise your children. That is something that you are very privileged and very lucky to be able to do. And that's a really wonderful and positive thing. However, there are some people who would view this idea of a woman's place being in the home as actually very sexist and very misogynistic, and that actually there is no reason why a man's place cannot be to raise the children. They are, in fact, of course, his children, and to look after his own house. We have many households nowadays where both parents work and share equal domestic responsibilities and share equal care of the children. We have some households where the man, the father, is the one that stays at home with the children and the mother goes out to work. So nowadays things are a lot less stereotypical. There is still, however, the perception that a woman's place is with child rearing and through domestic chores, and you only have to look in the playground of any local primary school and look at the gender of the people who are standing in that playground, and it is predominantly female. So like I said, if we were going to be in the classroom now, we'd probably be having an interesting debate with your views on the matter. But like I said, this is a poem that it does very much focus on traditional gender roles. So today we're going to explore how Philip Larkin uses language, form and structure in afternoons. So by the end of the lesson, you will know the context of the poem, and we'll also be looking at the effect of the language, form and structure that he uses, as well as really thinking about what messages, what ideas is Larkin expressing in this poem. So if you can pause the video, please, and jot down our knowledge goal. So a little bit of context. Don't worry, we're going to read this through and then I'm going to switch over to the visualizer and we'll bullet point the sort of key points. Philip Larkin, born in 1922 and died in 1985, was born and lived in England. He was a very famous and popular poet at the time, was offered the honour of Poet Laureate in 1984, but he declined. He didn't want it, which pretty much summed up Philip Larkin really as a person. Poet Laureate, Ted Hughes was Poet Laureate, for example. Many of the poets that we are studying in this anthology were Poet Laureates in their lives. Poet Laureate is like the highest honour you can be given as a professional poet. But Philip Larkin refused. He wasn't interested in it. In a 2003 Poetry Book Society survey, Larkin was chosen as Britain's best loved poet of the previous 50 years. So again, still very popular. The Times named him Britain's greatest post-war writer in 2008. So he is somebody who is very popular. He studied English at Oxford. Again, many of these poets are people who studied English at university in this anthology. Now, this is really the most important bullet point, really. His personality was of a solitary English man who hated fame, and he didn't want to attach himself with public literary life. He wasn't like Scrooge in that he was selfish and misanthropic, but he was certainly solitary. He liked being by himself. He was not interested in sort of fame at all, which is why he refused to sort of be Poet Laureate. He led a very restricted life. He never married, although he did have, you know, various different relationships, but he never married, never had children, never travelled abroad, and he worked as a librarian for 30 years in Hull. So he's not somebody who actually went off and experienced an awful lot that life had to offer. He left a very sheltered life. He also was not able to serve in World War II because of his poor eyesight. So that would have had an effect on him as well, when of course all the other young men were going off to war. This was something Larkin could not do. So we're going to switch over to the visualizer now, and I'm just going to jot down some of that important contextual information. So hopefully we should all be able to see the poem now. So context. So we have the fact he was a British poet, and we're just going to look. Just checking the dates. He was a British poet. He was very popular in his lifetime and today. We know that he led a solitary life. He never married or had children. Went abroad and We know he did not want to be famous. This is a really important point as well. His poetry is observational. Okay, it's what he observes and notices, not necessarily what he's experienced. Now, this is very important. You know, this idea that his poetry is often observational. He's not necessarily writing in his poetry about things that he has gone through himself. He's writing about things that he has witnessed or seen or observed. And that is what we see in this poem. So what's really important to understand here, sorry, I just clicked off that. What's important to understand in this poem is that he is somebody who never married and had children and led a very solitary life, and that his poetry is observational. He writes about things that he witnesses and that he sees rather than things that he has experienced himself. So pause the video if you need to and get that jotted down. So, afternoons then. We always have a little bit of a look at the title. Now, this poem is a good one to compare to Autumn, because what Larkin is doing here is he is also using the day, using the cycle of the day and the seasons to represent a human life cycle. So think back to Autumn, the poem about autumn into winter, doing this idea of the prime of life into old age, retirement, and then death. Larkin is doing something similar here with the cycle of the days and the cycle of the seasons to show a human life cycle. And we look at different stages of a human's life, but the subject matter of the poem is a little bit different. Whereas To Autumn personifies nature, in Afternoons, we're focusing in on motherhood. So let's think about afternoon then. We would say the afternoon is, again, this idea of sort of middle age. The afternoon of your life, if you like, would be a bit like, I don't know, late summer into autumn, this idea of middle age. What he does in this poem, Larkin, is he focuses on mothers, motherhood. This poem is essentially about motherhood. Now, if you'd been listening to what I said about the context, you would be thinking, okay, here is a man who never married, never had children, writing about motherhood. Not sure he knows an awful lot about that. Had he been a father, he would have had first-hand witness, I suppose. But you still could argue that a childless male poet, not necessarily the most qualified to write about motherhood. And quite a lot of my classes tend to joke that every text or poem we ever do, I say, oh, I really, really love this. This is my favourite. And actually, I really, really dislike this poem. So this is a novelty. I know I probably shouldn't say that as an English teacher, but this poem, for lots of reasons, sort of infuriates me. For those of you that have been taught by me for many years and know me well, by the end of this poem, you can probably guess why I may have issues with this. So anyway, after that joyful introduction to it, let's have a look. So summer is fading. Essentially what we're being told there is that this is the end of summer. So we have again this focus, like into autumn, of time. So if we've said, you know, that a sort of end of summer is middle age, we have this idea, if you want to be depressing about it, of leaving the best times of your life or leaving your youth behind. Just going to add that onto here. Leaving your youth, because that is essentially what this poem is about. Leaving these mothers leaving their youth, their carefree youth behind. And that's represented through this idea of being in the afternoon and through, again, summer turning into autumn. The leaves fall in ones and twos from trees bordering the new recreation ground. So what we have described in this poem is a new park, okay, recreation ground. And around this recreation ground are trees. Now, the fact that there are trees around the outside is creating an image of imprisonment. This idea that actually these trees are around this sort of edge of this big field or this play park. It's actually slightly sinister or got sinister overtones. And it's this idea of actually imprisonment. Because what he's essentially saying is, as these mothers are leaving their youth behind because they've become mothers, they're imprisoned in their sort of this life, if you like, this wife and mother role. In the hollows of afternoons, young mothers assemble. So if something's hollow, it's empty. So is he saying their lives are empty? Certainly got negative connotations here. Young mothers. This is really important. Their young mothers assemble. Now, assemble, again, like in school, again, this idea of a lack of freedom. They assemble. It's like a routine or their duty. And whilst I can speak as a mother myself, going to play parks gets a little tedious, it's this idea that this is some sort of negative routine or duty that they're forced to sort of do daily. So they assemble at swing and sandpit, setting free their children. Now, this is quite a sort of interesting concept here, because you could view it in a couple of different ways. This idea of setting free could be, you know, this idea of their children need to sort of burn off energy. But it could also represent, you know, could be a contrast to the sort of freedom of childhood. You know, now that they have grown up, these young mothers have lost their freedom because they are mothers now. So we have almost this potential jealousy or resentment of the fact that their children have these sorts of carefree lives, and it's the sort of carefree lives that these young mothers do not have. Now, I just want to pause to give a little bit of the context, I guess, about the, you know, period of time this was written. You know, this poem was written in 1959. So essentially, you have the sort of context of the 50s and 60s. Now, what we have here is some sort of quite ingrained prejudices that would have existed at the time. It's important to mention. Firstly, this idea that a woman's place is at home, raising the children. Again, this is symptomatic of the sort of 50s and 60s attitude. But what we also have is this idea of social class. Now, while social class was not anywhere near the level it is in, say, an inspector calls, or sort of this, really strict class system, because we know that World War I and World War II sort of muddied that up a little bit. There was still a far more rigid class system then than there, say, is today. So what we have here is he focuses on working class families, and we know that through several pieces of language that he uses. So behind them, at intervals, we're going to come back to that, stand husbands in skilled trades. So this is skilled trades is telling us that these husbands are working class. But interesting that behind them at intervals, it's this idea that the fathers are removed sort of from the situation a little bit, because it wasn't perceived as being a man's place to be at home, look after the children. So it's interesting that behind them at intervals stand husbands in skilled trades. Now we have this more idea about social class, an estate full of washing. So with estate, again, there were a lot of council estates built during this time period. Council estates were at the time to provide affordable housing, again, for the working class. So this idea of an estate full of washing, it's a very domestic image, but it's also, quite boring. Who in their right mind would want to sit in a council flat all day washing clothes? But when you have small children, you get through an awful lot of washing. So it's this sort of boring domestic image, I guess, of these women, these working class women who spend their time in their, council houses or their council flats, and they all come out and assemble on the new recreation ground to sort of let their children have a bit of a runabout sort of every day. And it's just this cycle of sort of monotony, or this sort of dull, according to Larkin at least, this sort of dull existence that they're forced into, because that's just sort of what happens when you get older. You get married, you have children, you become a housewife. And that's what he focuses in on this middle verse, this idea of these women as wives. And albums lettered "Our Wedding" lying near the television. Now, this juxtaposition of a wedding album and the television is quite interesting as well. So it's like when they were married, they were like still young and carefree. And the TV, again, represents sort of this boring domestic life that this couple now find them in. And what we have here, interestingly, is the sort of colon here, introducing from this whole idea of when they married, they would have still been young, excited, actually lying next to the television, where they probably, which is probably all they do, is the children are asleep, they sit in front of the television. That's their life now. That then introduces this whole idea of these next couple of lines. Before them, the wind is ruining their courting places that are still courting places, but the lovers are all in school. Now, a courting place where they used to meet, you know, when they first got together. Courting is this old-fashioned concept. You know, Americans would call it dating, for example, I guess. So it's where they used to meet when they first got together. This idea that the wind is ruining their courting places could represent time, or in fact children, because, you know, their lives aren't the same anymore. They've gone into that next stage of life, which is married with children. So this idea of the wind ruining their courting places, that wind could represent time. That's just the cycle of a human life. Again, stereotypically, you meet someone, you get married, you have children, you become a housewife, or you go out to work, or even the fact that the children are almost even ruining the excitement of their relationship when they first got together. So this courting place, I don't know, let's imagine it's a field, or I don't know, behind the bike sheds, that are still courting places, but the lovers are all in school. So this is another idea of time. A new generation of couples meet there. However, this is another poem about cycles, circles, like into autumn. Any couple that now hangs out in this courting place, because they're teenagers and that's what you do, they will eventually get married, they will eventually have children, and they will end up in exactly the same place as these young mothers. So it's like this idea again of this sort of natural progression of life. But Larkin isn't presenting that natural progression of life as a good thing in this poem. It's a miserable little poem, really. And their children, so intent on finding more unripe acorns, expect to be taken home. Now, these unripe acorns, you know, symbolize, you know, the children. You know, they are still young and carefree, but they will ripen, they will grow, they will meet someone one day and have their own courting place, and they will get married and have children, and the whole cycle will just continue. So again, we can see why this is a really good poem to compare to Autumn, because it's, again, this same idea of this natural cycle of life. Again, expect to be taken home. It's this idea of a routine. Well, we go out to play, and then we come home, and then we'll have tea, and then we'll have, you know, a bath, and then we'll go to bed, and then the whole thing will happen again and again and again until they grow up, and then they get married, and then they'll have the same thing happen again and again and again. So that's why we use the word monotonous. You know, it's very sort of every day is the same. This line always vaguely makes me want to punch Larkin, personally. Their beauty has thickened or laugh, one of the two. So thickened is a really unusual / vaguely insulting sort of adjective to use here. So the beauty of these women have thickened. Now, when you are pregnant and when you give birth, your body has essentially grown another human being and pushed it out, and then often nurtured it through breastfeeding. So, you know, a person's body or a woman's body changes during this time. And rather than celebrate that as wonderful givers of life for which humanity would die and be extinct, women tend to be judged on this change of their appearance. You only have to look at celebrities that have given birth in those awful magazines people like to read, and it's always, oh, my, look at so-and-so's post-baby body, and when will they get their figure back? And this whole idea that actually, you know, again, motherhood or your body changing because of motherhood is something negative. And so by presenting their beauty as thickening, it's almost showing, you know, motherhood has essentially made them lose their, you know, attractiveness. So not only has it, you know, destroyed their relationship and made their lives monotonous and miserable, it's also made them fat and ugly as well. So who'd have children, eh? Is mostly Larkin's attitude here, it seems. And then just to end it on a equally negative note, something is pushing them to the side of their own lives. So again, being wives and mothers mean that their own needs don't matter. It's this idea of, I don't know, this martyr syndrome. Oh, I'm a wife and a mother now. I can't have anything for myself. I can't have my own hopes and dreams. Everything I am. Sorry, that keeps happening every time I jolt this. Everything I am ends up having to focus on my children. Now, I said at the start of the poem that this isn't one I particularly like. And again, you can probably guess why now. But we need to remember this is a poem written in 1959. I would like to think that all of the modern students that you are viewing this poem would potentially have some of the same gender stereotypes, anti-motherhood, misogynistic vibes that this poem has going on, that in the light of the way we view things in the 21st century, hopefully we think most people don't hold to these beliefs. But it is really important to consider that Larkin, A, wasn't a mother himself, and B, never even had children. He never even witnessed someone going through motherhood. So that's when we link back to this idea of his poetry being observational. To him, he has probably sat and observed these mothers, although that does sound slightly creepy, hopefully not in a creepy way, has sat and observed, you know, these mothers and children playing, and he has made assumptions about their lives based on some of his own ingrained class prejudices by the sounds of it. And he has made an assumption based on his observation, and this poem is reflecting those views. So when you write about the context, it is important to understand that it is observational, because we know for a fact that this is not written based on his sort of personal experience of even fatherhood. So yes, you finally found a poem we've studied that I'm not automatically saying I love. So we're just going to complete one more task before we go. Just going to flick through to it. So what I'd like you to do, just to again consolidate your understanding, how does Larkin present motherhood in Afternoons? Couple of sentences. How has Larkin presented the passing of time in Afternoons? So just have a go and see if you can answer both of those questions. You don't need to write very much, just a couple of sentences. Please either take a picture of your work and send it through via the Teams assignment, or if you've typed this up, you can just attach that and hand it in so I can see and assess your understanding. I will see you next time.